3:33 a.m. The Persian Gulf, 26 degrees north latitude, 54 degrees east longitude. The threat assessment had classified it as an emerging capability for 3 years. Not operational, not fielded at scale, not validated against a defended target. The intelligence community's 2022 assessment had used the phrase developmental status with unclear deployment timeline. The 2023 revision had changed that to probable limited operational capability. The 2024 update, issued 7 months before the current engagement, had removed the word limited. At 3:33 a.m., the IRGC Navy demonstrated what the removal of that word meant. The first domain activated underwater from 11 pre-positioned release points across the Gulf floor, positions that had been prepared over an 8-month period, during which IRGC diving teams had conducted what appeared to be routine seabed maintenance operations on the Gulf's undersea pipeline inspection network. 214 autonomous underwater vehicles began their approach toward the USS Carl Vinson carrier strike group's operating position. Each UUV was a purpose-built system, 2.3 meters long, 28 centimeters in diameter, battery-powered with an 18-hour endurance at 8 knots, carrying a 40-kilogram shaped charge warhead designed to detonate against a ship's hull below the waterline. The warhead configuration had been optimized through reverse engineering of commercial salvage explosive data to produce maximum structural damage against the hull geometry of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, specifically at the bilge keel area, where the hull's curvature created a pressure-focusing geometry favorable to an underwater detonation. The UUVs operated autonomously from their release points to a pre-programmed search corridor. They did not require continuous command links. They did not emit radio frequency signals that could be detected and jammed. They navigated by inertial guidance, supplemented by acoustic correlation against the ambient noise signatures of the formation's propulsion systems. Each UUV had been preloaded with acoustic templates of the specific ship types in the formation. They were not looking for generic targets. They were looking for the bilge keel geometry of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers specifically. Simultaneously, the second domain activated on the surface. From 6 collection points along the Iranian coastline between Qeshm Island and Bandar Lenga, 147 Iran Shahed naval USVs, autonomous surface vessels, roughly analogous in concept to the Ukrainian maritime drones that had been used against Russian Black Sea Fleet assets, were released simultaneously. Each USV displaced 1.2 tons, carried a 150-kilogram fragmentation warhead in its bow section, and had a maximum speed of 40 knots. They operated in coordinated swarms of 12 to 18 vessels, with each swarm assigned a specific approach vector and a specific target in the formation. The IRGC's naval drone doctrine had been developed by studying every publicly available assessment of Ukrainian maritime drone operations, incorporating lessons about radar detection avoidance through low freeboard hull design, deception routing to complicate engagement sequencing, and the specific formation geometries that maximized the number of simultaneous terminal approaches against a single target. The 147 USVs were not all aimed at the carrier. 41 were aimed at USS Halsey, the Arleigh Burke destroyer on the formation's southern perimeter, the ship whose active sonar search pattern had been observed and mapped over 3 days to identify the gap intervals during which its coverage of the southern approach corridor was at minimum. 37 were aimed at USS Bunker Hill, the Ticonderoga cruiser serving as the formation's air defense coordinator. 29 were aimed at USS Lake Champlain on the eastern perimeter. The remaining 40 were aimed at the Carl Vinson herself, routed on approach vectors specifically designed to arrive simultaneously from 4 different quadrants. The third domain activated from the air. From 11 launch positions across the southern Iranian coastal region, 190 Shahed-136 and Shahed-238 loitering munitions were released between 3:33 a.m. and 3:49 a.m. in 6 sequential waves. The Shahed-238 was a new configuration, a jet-powered variant of the Shahed-136 with a maximum speed of 350 km per hour compared to the propeller-driven 136's 185 km per hour. The jet variant had appeared in IRGC inventory only 9 months earlier. Its higher speed compressed the defensive network's intercept window against each individual weapon and complicated the engagement sequencing for F/A 18F sorties that had trained against the slower propeller profile. The air component's targeting was not the carrier. The air component was aimed at the surface combatants' topside systems, specifically the radar arrays, CIWS mounts, and communications antennas that represented each ship's ability to detect and engage the UUV and USV threats in the other 2 domains. A Shahed-136 detonating against an Arleigh Burke's Spy-1 radar array did not sink the ship. It blinded it against the underwater and surface threats that were simultaneously approaching from below and from the waterline. 3 domains. Simultaneous activation. Sequence to arrive in an overlapping window that would require the formation's defensive systems to simultaneously process underwater acoustic contacts, surface radar contacts, and airborne drone tracks. 3 separate sensor and engagement domains, at the same time that each domain's threats were designed to degrade the sensors used to detect the other domains. The design was not sophisticated in the individual weapon sense. Each UUV was simpler than a 1970s torpedo. Each USV was less capable than a 1980s fast patrol boat. Each Shahed was cheaper than a 1990s artillery rocket. The sophistication was in the simultaneity and the cross-domain sequencing. The IRGC had not built 3 expensive weapons. It had built 3 inexpensive weapons whose value came entirely from being used at the same moment in a way that required their target to engage 3 separate threat categories simultaneously with sensor and weapon systems that had not been designed to do that. The formation's defensive architecture had been designed around a singular assumption that threats would arrive from one domain at a time, managed by the sensor suite optimized for that domain. Anti-submarine warfare used sonar. Anti-surface warfare used radar and gun systems. Counter-drone operations used CIWS, CRAM, and airborne intercepts. 3 separate sensor types. 3 separate engagement systems. 1 formation processing all 3 simultaneously, and each threat category degrading the sensors needed for the others. 3:33 a.m. USS Carl Vinson, Combat Direction Center. The watch officer had been tracking an unusual acoustic environment in the formation's southern sector since 3:18 a.m. The passive sonar array on USS Halsey had begun returning a diffuse, low-frequency noise pattern that the acoustic intelligence team aboard the Carl Vinson had been analyzing for 15 minutes. The pattern was not consistent with the ambient biological noise typical of the northern Persian Gulf at this hour. It was not consistent with merchant shipping traffic. It was consistent with 214 small-diameter propulsion units operating simultaneously at low speed from multiple approach vectors. The watch officer had requested an urgent acoustic classification from the fleet's organic anti-submarine warfare helicopter at 3:21 a.m. The MH-60R had diverted to an active dipping sonar search at 3:24 a.m. At 3:31 a.m., the dipping sonar had returned its first positive contact characterization. Multiple small contacts, propeller signature consistent with autonomous underwater vehicle profile, bearing 190 to 230 degrees, estimated range 4 to 7 kilometers. At 3:33 a.m., the same minute the UUV release network activated, the surface radar picture showed the first USV swarm contacts appearing simultaneously across a 180-degree arc from the Iranian coastline. 47 radar contacts at ranges between 28 and 44 kilometers, speed 38 to 41 knots, closing on the formation. And at 3:34 a.m., the air picture filled with Shahed tracks emerging from the coastal zone. All three domains were visible simultaneously. The formation had 90 seconds of sensor clarity before the first Shahed impacts would begin affecting the surface radar arrays. Those 90 seconds were the operational margin the formation had to sequence its response before the cross-domain degradation that the IRGC had engineered began to take effect. The watch officer made 3 decisions in those 90 seconds that shaped the engagement's outcome. First, he redirected all 4 MH-60R helicopters from their standard perimeter patrol pattern to an immediate UUV intercept tasking, using a combination of lightweight torpedoes and die-cast active sonar buoys to prosecute the underwater contacts. The UUV threat was the only threat category whose approach could not be engaged by any surface-mounted system in the formation's current configuration. The MH-60R was the only available tool against the underwater domain. It was more important than its normal anti-submarine warfare mission. It was reassigned. Second, he directed USS Halsey and USS Lake Champlain to immediately execute 180-degree course reversals and begin moving away from the USV swarms at maximum speed, increasing the USV approach time and allowing the formation's 5-inch gun systems and CIWS to engage the slower-closing swarms before they reached close range. Moving away from a closing threat is tactically counterintuitive in most naval contexts. Against a swarm of surface drones with a top speed of 40 knots, a destroyer at 32 knots moving away buys approximately 18 minutes of additional approach time. That was 18 additional minutes for gun systems to engage. Third, he did not redirect the carrier air wing's F/A-18F sorties toward the USV swarm. He kept them assigned to the Shahed intercept tasking. The Shahed's targeting of topside sensor systems was the cross-domain threat multiplier. If the Shahed succeeded in degrading the formation's radar picture, the USV and UUV engagements would become progressively harder to manage. Protecting the sensors was the prerequisite for managing the other threats. The MH-60R crews received their UUV intercept tasking at 3:34 a.m. They had not been briefed specifically on the UUV concept before this watch period. They had been briefed on it in general terms 6 weeks earlier in a threat update that had included a 15-minute module on the IRGC's maritime UUV program. The module had included a section on engagement. The MH-60R's Mark 54 lightweight torpedo was assessed as effective against the UUV profile if it could acquire the target on its active sonar. The UUV's acoustic signature was below the Mark 54's passive sonar acquisition threshold. Active sonar acquisition was possible at ranges under 200 meters. The crews adapted their engagement approach, DICASS buoys, to generate the active sonar coverage field, MH-60R, hovering above the active coverage zone to observe returns and generate Mk-54 targeting solutions from the buoy data. It was not the standard anti-submarine warfare protocol. It was the closest available approximation for a target category the system had not been designed to defeat. Between 3:38 a.m. and 4:09 a.m., the 4 MH-60R crews conducted 31 Mk-54 engagements against UUV contact identified through the DICASS active field. Of 214 UUVs released, the MH-60R engagement neutralized 89. The acoustic characterization of the die-cast returns was not always sufficient to distinguish a neutralized UUV from an evading one. Crews reported post-engagement uncertainty on 23 of the 89 claimed kills. The uncertainty did not stop the engagement. It was logged and continued. Of the 125 UUVs that were not intercepted by airborne anti-submarine warfare, 67 lost acoustic correlation to the formation's ships when the course reversal maneuvering displaced the ships from the UUV's pre-programmed approach geometry. A UUV navigating by acoustic template loses its reference signal when the target's bearing changes beyond its programmed corridor. 67 UUVs continued on their original heading. and impacted the sea floor in the formation's previous operating position. They found no hull geometry. They detonated against the bottom. 58 UUVs maintained acoustic correlation through the course reversal. Their programming had incorporated a wider search corridor that accommodated target maneuvering. They continued their approach. 17 were detected at close range by the MH-60R's dipping sonar during secondary search passes and engaged with Mk-54. 11 were neutralized. 6 reached hull proximity of the formation's surface combatants. At 4:04 a.m., 4 UUVs detonated against USS Halsey's hull in the bilge keel zone within a 90-second window. The shaped charges produced 4 simultaneous hull breach events on the destroyer's port side. The flooding was immediate and involved 4 separate compartments. USS Halsey's damage control teams executed the emergency flooding response protocol. They contained the flooding to a level that preserved the ship's stability, but the damage was assessed as requiring dry dock repair. USS Halsey reduced speed to 8 knots and transmitted a damage report. She was combat capable at severely reduced capacity. 2 UUVs detonated against USS Bunker Hill. 1 breached a non-critical external section above the waterline during a maneuvering evolution that had shifted the ship's orientation at the moment of detonation. 1 breached the hull at the designed depth and produced a controllable flooding event in a single compartment. The 147 USVs were engaged by the combined 5-inch gunfire from 4 surface combatants, CIWS point defense, and the CRAM systems aboard the carrier. The 5-inch gun at ranges between 8 and 18 kilometers was the primary engagement tool against the USV swarms, a gun against surface target engagement for which the naval gun system was well suited. Between 3:41 a.m. and 4:17 a.m., the formation's surface combatants engaged the USV swarms continuously with naval gunfire and CIWS. The course reversal that had extended the approach time was what made this sustained engagement feasible. 18 additional minutes of naval gun engagement range. Of 147 USVs, 112 were neutralized by naval gunfire and CIWS before reaching close range. 35 reached the inner engagement zone. 22 were neutralized by CIWS and CRAM. 13 reached detonation range. 9 detonated against surface combatants. 4 detonated in proximity, misses that generated pressure effects without hull contact. Of the 9 hull impacts, 7 struck Arleigh Burke-class destroyers in varying locations across their superstructure and hull. 2 struck the Carl Vinson's hull at the waterline. The 150-kilogram fragmentation warheads producing blast damage at the carrier's hull in 2 locations above the engineering spaces. The hull was not breached. The blast effects damaged external fittings, and 1 below-deck equipment room accessed through the impacted hull section. The 190 Shahed air component was engaged by FA-18F sorties and by CIWS across the formation. The directed energy systems aboard USS Dewey and USS Stockdale, the AN/SEQ-3 laser systems that had been operationally validated in the Arabian Sea scenario, accounted for 52 Shahed neutralizations across the 6 waves. F/A 18F sorties neutralized 84. CIWS neutralized 39. Of 190 Shaheds, 175 were intercepted or neutralized. 15 impacted across 5 surface combatants. The Shahed impacts produced the cross-domain degradation the IRGC had designed for. USS Bunker Hill's Sampson equivalent SPQ-9B radar array was damaged by 2 Shahed impacts on its superstructure. USS Lake Champlain lost her forward CIWS mount to a Shahed impact. The degradation of these systems had not been sufficient to prevent engagement of the other domain threats. The MH-60R sorties and naval gun systems had continued operating, but it had reduced the effectiveness of the inner defense ring during the period when the UUV and USV threats were reaching their closest ranges. The cross-domain sequencing had worked as designed. It had not worked well enough. By 4:21 a.m., the last Shahed wave had been processed. The last USV swarm had been engaged to below threatening density, and the MH-60R force had completed its active sonar barrier sweep and confirmed no additional UUV contacts within 3 kilometers of any formation vessel. The engagement was complete. By minute 28 of the combined engagement, the United States had expended $740 million in interceptors, torpedoes, naval ammunition, and laser power cells. The figure was lower than any previous engagement in the series, not because the threat had been less severe, but because the primary defensive tools against 2 of the 3 threat domains had been Mark 54 lightweight torpedoes at $120,000 each, 5-inch naval rounds at $800 each, and directed energy at $9 per engagement. The exchange ratio mathematics had inverted from the Shahed against interceptor problem of the Arabian Sea scenario. Against UUVs and USVs, the expensive asset was on the attacking side. A $40,000 UUV defeated by a $120,000 torpedo was still an unfavorable exchange ratio for the defender, but it was recoverable. A $40,000 UUV defeated by a Mark 54, and a $4 million SM-6 was not a problem the defender had been required to solve today. The IRGC had built a 3-domain swarm concept that had achieved more simultaneous hull contacts across a formation than any previous Iranian engagement. USS Halsey required dry dock, the most significant damage to a U.S. surface combatant short of a through-hull warhead impact in this series. 7 additional surface combatants had varying degrees of structural damage across all 3 threat domains. The carrier had received 2 waterline blast impacts. 0 ships had been sunk. 0 ships had been removed from combat-capable status, except USS Halsey at severely degraded capacity. The 3-domain concept had identified a genuine gap in the formation's integrated defensive architecture. The gap was the simultaneous prosecution requirement across 3 separate sensor and engagement domains. The formation had closed the gap through 3 decisions made in 90 seconds. MH-60R reassignment, course reversal maneuver, and air wing retention on Shahed tasking. Remove any one of those 3 decisions and the outcome changed materially. The watch officer who made those decisions had been awake for 19 hours when the engagement began. 4:21 a.m. USS Carl Vinson, Combat Direction Center. The formation's damage status board showed amber and red indicators across 7 of 8 surface combatants. The carrier herself showed 2 amber hull indicators from the waterline impacts. USS Halsey showed a red dry dock indicator, the worst outcome on the board. The watch officer logged the engagement completion time. He had the formation's available defensive resources assessed. CIWS ammunition depleted to between 18% and 44% across the affected ships. MH-60R crews at their maximum continuous flight hours. 2 of the 4 crews required mandatory rest before they could fly again. F/A-18 UUVs ready aircraft reduced by 3 due to maintenance requirements from surge operations. USS Halsey's contribution to the formation's defensive architecture effectively removed. He also had 7 surface combatants that were still underway, a carrier that was still generating sorties, and a Persian Gulf in which the IRGC had just expended its complete 3-domain swarm inventory, 551 autonomous systems across 3 domains, in a single engagement that had not achieved any of its targeting objectives against the formation's operational core. Time from first UUV detection to last threat neutralization. 48 minutes. Combined IRGC systems committed. 214 UUVs, 147 naval USVs, 190 Shahed-136, and Shahed-238 loitering munitions. Total, 551 autonomous systems across 3 domains. UUV results, 89 neutralized by MH-60R Mk-54 engagement. 67 detonated on seafloor after losing acoustic correlation. 17 neutralized by secondary dipping sonar engagement. 6 reached hull proximity. 6 detonated against surface combatants. USV results: 112 neutralized by 5-inch naval gun and CIWS engagement. 22 neutralized by CIWS and CRAM inner zone. 4 proximity detonations, no hull contact. 9 hull impacts across surface combatants and carrier. Shad results: 52 neutralized by directed energy. 84 by F/A 18F sorties. 39 by CIWS. 15 impacted across 5 surface combatants. Physical effects: USS Halsey, 4 UUV hull breaches, bilge keel zone, controllable flooding, dry dock assessment required, speed 8 knots, combat capable at severely degraded capacity. USS Bunker Hill, 2 UUV breaches, 1 controllable, 1 non-critical, SPQ-9B radar, damaged by Shahed impacts. USS Lake Champlain, forward CIWS, disabled by Shahed. Carl Vinson, 2 waterline blast impacts, no hull breach, external damage only. 4 additional destroyers with varying Shahed superstructure impacts, all combat capable. Directed energy system ammunition, unlimited. 5-inch naval rounds expended. 4,100 rounds across 4 ships. CIWS ammunition, 18% to 44% remaining across engaged ships. MH-60R Mark 54 torpedoes, 31 expended, replenishment required. Total engagement cost, $740 million. The IRGC had answered the Arabian Sea scenario's exchange ratio problem with a different logic. Instead of building weapons that were each expensive enough to threaten the formation, it had built weapons that were each cheap enough to saturate the formation's engagement capacity through volume alone. The 551 system swarm had cost approximately $28 million to produce. The U.S. defensive expenditure to stop it had been $740 million. That exchange ratio, 1 to 26 in the attacker's favor by cost, was the number that would be studied in every defense procurement review for the next decade. The swarm had not sunk a ship. It had confirmed that the exchange ratio problem was real, was operationally significant, and was not resolved by the current generation of defensive systems. The directed energy systems had $9 per engagement economics. They had neutralized 52 systems. The path to resolving the exchange ratio problem was visible in that number. It was not yet fielded at the scale the exchange ratio required. That was tomorrow's procurement problem. Tonight, the formation was still there.